I learned how to get on the phone with somebody who did not know me and frankly, just keep them on the phone. The art of persuasion, how do I keep them on long enough that they'll trust that A, I have something of value to offer, but B, I'm genuinely interested in what they're doing. And that the art of the conversation became really important later in life.
I'm Sam Christensen, and this is All Things Negotiation. Today, my guest is Mark Gainey. Mark Gainey is a successful tech entrepreneur. In fact, a very successful tech entrepreneur. He's built two companies in unrelated spaces. The first was Kana Software in the enterprise software space. The second is Strava, a consumer app to track fitness. Many of you are probably users, as he has over 125 million users that are active today. In our broad-ranging conversation, we talk about how he negotiated with his co-founder, how he negotiated with venture capitalists, how he negotiated with his community that had their own ideas about which direction Strava should go, and how he expanded internationally. I think you'll enjoy the conversation. I've been really looking forward to this. We've known each other since the late 90s. We were both doing startups. Yours ended up being more successful than mine. I probably should have just quit and invested in yours. But
I don't know about that.
Well, we're going to talk about both of your startups. And before we even get into that, let's just talk about when you came out of college, you went to Harvard, and then you took a job at TA Associates. So talk a little bit about what you learned in that job and how it got you excited for entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I was pretty fortunate. I had no business getting that job, but they liked hiring athletes, and I'd had a good career as a rower. And so I did. I went to work for somewhere between a venture capital and private equity firm in the early 90s. I worked in downtown Palo Alto for three great partners. And my job was very simple, Stan. It was to get on the phone every day and call businesses, call startups. We were looking for a very specific kind of company. We were looking for a bootstrapped, profitable, growing business, almost the antithesis of what you look for in Silicon Valley, right? We were trying to find that scrappy entrepreneur who figured out how to make a successful business without outside capital. And then TA's model was to figure out a way to, frankly, persuade, negotiate their way right into oftentimes just a minority position in those companies. So because they weren't looking for capital, I had a job. As a kid coming out of college, it was my job to go find those businesses, call on those entrepreneurs, and then if it was an interesting company, figure out a way to allow them to, ultimately allow us to invest, but at least go and visit. So that was the job. I spent almost 4.5 years doing it, calling entrepreneurs all over the country. And what a great way. I always joke, I got paid to go to business school. I basically, heard case study after case study, not only of great companies, but a lot of tough companies, a lot of companies that weren't doing so well. And you learn a lot from them at the same time.
It's probably a place I should have followed you as well. I did go to business school and spent a lot of money. And you got the education for free. So I think you're smarter than me there as well. So as you know, later in life, I co-founded an investment bank, and we actually borrowed from that TA model and hired cold callers. And the way I would recruit kids to that job coming out of some of the better schools was to say, look, if you want to learn how to be an entrepreneur, the best thing to do is A, learn sales skills, B, talk to entrepreneurs. So I actually think that's the best training you could have gotten to be an entrepreneur.
I could not agree more. I mean, in hindsight, at the time, I was just I've got two sons who just graduated from college. And so we're talking a lot about first jobs. And I fully admit that at the time I was in over my head and I didn't understand the businesses I was calling on. And it was a grind. I mean, honestly, it was literally, I had numbers I had to make every week and every month. But in hindsight, I know so much of what you like to talk about on the podcast is, concept of persuasion and negotiation and so forth. I mean, I learned how to get on the phone with somebody who did not know me and frankly, just keep them on the phone. The art of persuasion, how do I keep them on long enough that they'll trust that A, I have something of value to offer, but B, I'm genuinely interested in what they're doing. And that the art of the conversation became really important later in life.
Well, famously, you met your co-founder for two companies. When you're still an undergrad at Harvard, Michael Horvath, you guys, as you mentioned, were on the rowing team together. And you had to persuade him of a couple of things. One is, he was on an academic track. In fact, he was thinking about where to go. And you told me once that you persuaded him to come out to Stanford. Then you persuaded him to leave that job and come join you. I almost need Michael on the podcast to say, what was it that Mark did to persuade you? So if you remember those conversations or the things that you did to persuade him, because those are two pretty big leaps that he made to be your co-founder twice.
Yeah. I don't know how much credit I can take for actually getting him from Chicago at the time where he was getting his PhD and earned his PhD out to Stanford. I think Stanford probably had a lot to do with that as well. That was a pretty prestigious opportunity to come and join the faculty. I do remember we talked a lot about just lifestyle. I had just run the Chicago Marathon with him out in Chicago, and I said, "Hey, this is fun, but my weather's much better here in California if we want to keep running and staying active." So I think between the just the weather and what Stanford had to offer, it was pretty easy to get Michael and his wife Anna at the time out to California. But becoming my co-founder at Kana, you're right. There was an art to that. Truth be told, I had cast a wide net. I was trying to convince a number of my friends, would they be willing to join me on the journey? And most of them were probably pretty smart and, had much better opportunities at the time and couldn't quite see the vision that we had. Actually, we didn't have the vision. We pivoted multiple times. So they were probably right. But in Michael's case, the joke we always talk about, first, it was never an either or. I never asked him to leave academia. And in fact, he didn't. He just for clarification, he stayed. He managed to kind of do both. He stayed in academia while we launched Kana. The man worked obscene hours, as you often hear these stories. And he stayed at Stanford for a while. And then he actually did a stint in the Midwest. And then ultimately ended up out in Dartmouth teaching entrepreneurship at Tuck Business School, frankly, while we were still building Kana in its latter years. So one of the tricks to sort of persuading him was to never sort of force him to have a hard choice, but just take advantage of what he could give me. At the earliest days, he could give me a high-speed internet connection, which is what Stanford University had. So it's easy to think about that now, but at the time, that was really valuable. So just having a co-founder who had an office on the campus was great. And then, over time, I think that he really appreciated, he was kind of using the two sides of his brain. There was the academic and just the classroom side, but the entrepreneur side was a chance for him to kind of get his, use his hands literally at times. Like he was instrumental in just securing computers for us and office space and, doing a lot of the things that maybe I didn't have time for. So it was a great relationship that, as you mentioned, has now gone on 30 years.
How did you, going back to the beginning, we'll talk later in the podcast about different iterations of the companies and relative roles. But when you started, how did you formalize, or when did you formalize how you'd work together? Was that a handshake? Did you have an operating agreement in place? How did you kind of structure it? Who would do what? And what were kind of the legal things? I could talk about some mistakes I made with co-founders in that category.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with lots of co-founding teams in the past, and I have to admit, I think this is one where I was just incredibly fortunate that I already had the longstanding friendship with Michael. We weren't founders first who became friends. We were friends for 5, 6, 7 years prior to, and not just friends. We had been teammates. We had been rowers together, and then frankly, he kind of helped coach me, and so we had that behind us. So technically, when we first started Kana, and he may have a better recollection than I do, I have a funny memory at one point where we were even trying to figure out how to split the equity. And it was one of these things where, well, Mark, you're going to be doing the majority of the work because I can't leave the classroom. So, it should be 80-20. And a week later, he had done like a bunch of legal work and, going through, it's like, this doesn't seem right. I think it should be 70-30. I think we probably changed the split in the early days of Kana 4 or 5 times. With nothing more than mostly a handshake until we actually had to have something in writing and, actually have some founder shares. But at the early days, I had a nominal majority of shares just because I was committed to it full time and he was part time, and we were happy with that. And then we served on a board together at Kana until we raised our first series, and then it was. At the time, we didn't have a lot of leverage to negotiate, so one of those founder seats came away. So there were natural points along the way that kind of formalized it. But for Michael and I, the short answer to your question is there was a lot of handshake. There was just a lot of trust in one another, and we were always out to do the right thing for one another.
One of the things I say to my students is be careful of doing business with family or friends, because when there are misunderstandings, they can create a lot of hurt feelings. And so the tighter the relationship, the more important to have things in writing, getting a good operating agreement. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would actually, in your first statement. So it's ironic that Michael and I have done these two things together and have the friendship that we do, because after that, he and I had a bit of a pretty hard rule where we were pretty careful not to hire friends and family into the business, just because of exactly what you said. It does create a set of unnecessary sort of challenges, even under the best of conditions. Just bringing work home at times can be hard enough. So one, I would say be very cautious of that. And two, yeah, I think you're right. I think we're probably a bit of an anomaly. I'll be the first to admit, a lot of our stuff has been handshake. It starts with the friendship will always come first, but it doesn't mean that we don't make hard business decisions and that we won't disagree, and that we've done is devise ways over the years to determine how a decision will get made. Again, we've negotiated usually in advance, but not without its challenges. Michael and I've got a long list of where we've, had spirited conversations, and again, we always come back to that root thing of he is my friend first, and businesses are here to fill our waking hours. They should not be your entire life. There's a problem there if that's what's happening.
Just a quick anecdote from my side. I went and started a company with a guy, and we did have an operating agreement in place. It was basically legal boilerplate. And when we decided that it no longer made sense to work together, the lawyer that had drafted the agreement hadn't put any kind of a buy-sell agreement or a way to dissolve the partnership. And that ended up creating lots of heartache. We ended up having to go to mediation. And so I would just say, get an operating agreement in place early on in the co-founding partnership, and make sure you've done that with a lawyer that you can trust and that isn't going to miss something like that, because that was a big mistake in my career.
Yeah. Your story is far more common than mine. I'm the first to, that's why I say we have a bit of an anomaly that I'll take it because it's been wonderful, but we've also probably skirted a lot of issues that we probably shouldn't have.
You mentioned, let's talk a little bit. We're going to get to Strava, which I'm sure listeners want to hear about, since probably a lot of them are Strava users. But most people may have forgotten the name Kana Software. You and Michael co-founded this, and it's just, as I kind of looked back at your history, that's when you and I first met. And I remember when we sat down, I think it was late 90s, Kanna was not going so well. I would not have been an investor in Kanna at that point. And it turned out to be a big success. You mentioned earlier that you pivoted. So talk a little bit about what you guys did, and specifically inflection points where negotiation played a role in that company.
Quick history here. So Kanna was originally founded in 1995, when it was called Kana Sports. And the irony for all the Strava listeners was that was Strava, circa 1995. We were literally trying to build the Strava in the earliest days of the internet. We wanted this virtual locker room where we could bring all our friends back together on the internet and compete and share workouts and so forth. So that was the dream. We had a business plan we outlined, and we began the process of trying to build that. Good news and bad news. The bad news was, as we tried to build it, there were just many, many roadblocks. It was clear that the idea of even getting workouts onto a website was going to be challenging. The business model, we were really struggling as we tried to talk to sponsors and advertisers. As that these were all, everybody was trying to sort of figure out their own business model on the internet. So we ran up against just numerous roadblocks, while simultaneously listening to these potential partners tell us about their other issues. For instance, customer email. One of the reasons that they didn't want to sponsor the Kana Sports website was that they were fearful of the volume of customer email that they would receive. They were already getting too much and they didn't know what to do with it. So being objective entrepreneurs and wanting to build a successful business, we were listening, and what we heard was, okay, this Kana Sports may not be the right time, but they've got to address their customer email. So maybe there's a way for us to help these sports-related companies with their customer email. And again, I won't bore you with a long story. The short version of it was we ended up pivoting into customer email management and helping not just sports companies, but frankly, just about every company on the planet address customer email, and then over the long term, more sort of CRM, all the customer relationship tools that you needed to do business online. So that was a pretty dramatic pivot that came from just, the realization that we needed to stay objective and look for real problems. One of the lessons I had at TA Associates is if you're a startup and you can find real problems, doesn't matter how small you are, your potential customer will listen. And that's what we found.
Let's talk a little bit about pivoting. It's my experience that the vast majority of companies, at least in Silicon Valley, pivoted at some point, didn't end up doing what they started off doing. And it may be as I reflect on, my education in business school, which was very analytic, problem solving, find out what's wrong with companies and try to fix it. You not going to business school, you're more likely to sort of start something, not analyze too much and just get in the game and then pivot. Would you agree that kind of advice to young entrepreneurs is start something, get in there and figure it out, as opposed to every analysis has to be in place? I just think you can get into analysis paralysis trying to start a company.
Oh, yeah, 100% agree. One of the phrases I love to tell entrepreneurs when we sit down for coffee is like, I'll often hear this, well, I just don't have the right idea. And I said, look, let me be very clear. Whatever idea you start with, it's unlikely going to be the idea you finish with. But you need to have an idea to get conversations going. If you have something that you have to share with other people and you get it out and you start testing it with other people, whether that's with a prototype or just a conversation, and you're listening, the ideas will morph. They'll evolve, and sometimes they'll be massive. In the case of Kana, it went from sports to enterprise software, pretty massive pivot. But we were early enough in the Kana sports days that the investment was nominal. And what we were really trying to do was start a company that would solve a real problem. And so keeping that objectivity and then just accepting that it's going to evolve no matter what has served me well.
Well, that one pivoted in the right direction. I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong on my numbers, but I think, the market cap on that when it went public might have been more than $10 billion over a 5-year period. So that was a wild success for that time.
Yeah, we caught the tiger by the tail.
Yeah, nice to have success. And what I would have guessed you would have done next is another enterprise software company. You knew the ropes. You could have put that team back together. You and Michael got together. I think by this time you're maybe in your 40s. So, I think most great companies that get started great in terms of enterprise value get started by people earlier than 40. But you guys are in your 40s. You got together and said, let's do another one. Tell us a little bit about that decision and how that conversation went.
Yeah, you're right. We so if I back up a little bit, so he and I were both sort of out of Kana and moved on by the early 2000s. We each kind of went on interesting paths. As I mentioned, Michael was raising his family in Hanover, New Hampshire. He was teaching at Tuck. He was actually also joining some other startups. He was basically the COO for a biotech startup had spun out of Dartmouth. So he was knee deep in that and advising a handful of other companies and serving on boards. I was doing the same. I was, I like to joke, I was eating a lot of junk food. Board activity to me is like junk food. It tastes really good in the moment when you're in a board meeting and you're adding all this value, and then you walk out and you realize, I'm not sure I really added much there. It's not very satisfying, but that's what I was doing. It fulfilled a purpose at that time because I had other things going on personally. And got to 2006, and you're right, Michael and I are now in our early 40s. We've both sort of had enough of the junk food and serving on just boards. We want to be back in the game. We feel like we still have some life left in us, and we like to roll up our sleeves and build things. And you're right, it would have been easy to think about enterprise software again, but there were a couple things that were a trigger for us. One was both of us just like the intellectual challenge of something different. And having done enterprise, consumer was really interesting from an intellectual standpoint. And I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, one of the things that he and I did when we sat down to really begin thinking about our next business, we sat down and made a list of all the companies that we wish we'd founded, all these companies that we had admired. It's a great exercise, I think, for anybody to do. And in our case, the list was just full of these iconic consumer brands. It was the Patagonias and the Apples and the Oakleys and the Starbucks and the Virgins of the world that we all sort of knew as consumers that, boy, if only, not knowing the stories behind them, but just the love that we had for them, the trust that they had from their consumers, that we admired. And so we thought to ourselves, geez, could we do that? And could we do that given our technology background as software entrepreneurs? Could we maybe bring a trusted brand to the technology space, which frankly is few and far between? There's some amazing companies in this valley, but it's often not that consumer loyalty that you see. Great businesses, but not the ones that you see tattooed on somebody's, arm or ankle.
Mark, I've got to ask you, do you have any tattoos that say anything about Strava?
I don't, but we have customers who do. We literally have Strava members who have put the Strava logo onto their ankles and their arms. So we have Strava customers who've named their babies after Strava. I could tell you stories. So
wow,
I don't know whether that's good or bad, but
tell me one or two, and then we'll get back to the two of you founding it. What are two crazy Strava obsessive customer stories?
Oh, well, I'll give you two that I find that are very different but fascinating. One, I'm sure people have heard of Strava Art. If you haven't, go Google it. It's really fun to see. It's basically people have figured out how to use their GPS tracks when they go on a ride or a run to create pieces of art. And I mean, we've seen some amazing political statements via art. We've seen just some amazing sort of Olympics, and we've seen marriage proposals. People have gone out and literally ridden their bike to ask their fiance if they would marry them, their girlfriend. So those are fun. And then I'll give you one other that's just an amazing story. This goes back a couple of years ago. Received an email from a 47-year-old mountain biker in Austin, Texas, who was obsessed by Strava and its data. He was a really good mountain biker. He enjoyed riding with his friends, and he would always do very well on Strava. But he was bothered by the fact that Strava's data would always show his heart rate 20 to 30 beats higher than his buddies. And he was kind of convinced that Strava's data was just off. Something was wrong with what we were collecting. But it ultimately led him to go talk to his doctor and do some tests. And what the gentleman found was that he actually had what they call a widowmaker. He needed a quadruple bypass. He was asymptomatic. He didn't have any symptoms whatsoever. He thought he was in great health. But that little signal coming from Strava and sort of his obsession, sort of looking at all the information, sort of led him to make a decision that was fateful in a very good way. He's happy and healthy and back mountain biking. So
back to you, Mark. Got the band back together. You're going to pursue this dream that initially come up in the mid-90s. Anything you'd tell people about developing good communication or trust with a co-founder? Obviously, you had it, but there have to be lessons learned along the line in terms of trust and communication with a co-founder.
Yeah, so this one was a little different. So Michael and I were, first off, we were 50-50 partners in this endeavor from day one. That was never a negotiation. We were both in it full time. This is what we wanted to do. We were on opposite coasts. I was here in California in the Bay Area, and Michael was, I mentioned, back in New Hampshire. So we learned very quickly how to think about ourselves as a virtual organization. It led to a very specific kind of communication, which was there wasn't a day that didn't go by that we weren't talking multiple times a day. And that's literally almost continued to this day. I mean, it's amazing. We're 15 years into Strava, and it's very rare that Michael and I, not for Strava related things always, in fact, not often anymore, just given our respective roles in the company, but it's very rare that if I don't talk to him 3 or 4 times a week. So just that constant communication. If there's one piece of advice I'd have, you can never over communicate. It's just, it is the magic elixir. Problems happen when people don't talk to one another and do it frequently and repeat what they're saying. When we got in front of teams, we realized that even though we might have said something to the team once, you have to say it 3, 4, or 5 times, not because people aren't listening, but because they're processing lots of different things. They're focused on lots of different aspects of their job. So that was key for Michael and I, not just in the earliest days, but literally up until yesterday.
And did that happen? Let me ask a quick question there. Did that happen naturally, or were you explicit about it? Like, hey, let's work on our communication. I think we could improve our partnership. Did you ever do any of that kind of feedback two-way? And if so, was that helpful?
Yeah, we did. And I would say it's constantly evolving, in part just because of circumstances. I mean, I can, one story I'm sure we may get to is, Michael and I swapped CEO roles 4 times. I started as CEO, then he became CEO when I had a personal situation come up, and then vice versa. So in part, just circumstances sort of force the opportunity to sort of look at sort of what's working and not. Once we had an office, it became really clear the way that communication needed to change. I remember specifically when I was running the company for the second time and the office was in San Francisco, he knew when I would be commuting from the peninsula where I live up to the city, which was about, well, depending on the hour, sometimes I was in the car for an hour, hour and a half. But we just knew that would be the time at which we would talk. And when I was going home in the evening sometimes. So as silly as it sounds, like you very explicit around what works and what doesn't in the moment. We were real explicit once we really did have an office, the importance of in-person and trying to figure out how to do that effectively. It's easy today, post-COVID, to think about all the virtual tools and things, but that was, we were big believers in, how to get in front of each other as often as possible. So we had something, I'll share one anecdote that's kind of, I think, related to this. We would have what are called GBUs at Strava for many years, good, bad, and uglies. And they were just simply moments in time when we would sit down after a software release, after a major marketing campaign. It didn't matter what it was. It could have been anything. Could have been a major a hire that we had done where we had a big hiring team. But that group would sit down and do a GBU. And we'd just take a whiteboard and what were all the good things that came out of that process? What were all the bad things? What were all the ugly things? And, what are the unexpected things? And where would we want to change or modify? And just kind of building that into the culture at Strava proved to be invaluable because there was no pressure then. It was like, we're going to have good and bad, and we're going to have things we want to change. And by having that after kind of after the event allowed everybody the chance to kind of process and then share their thoughts.
That's great. Let's transition to capital. At some point, you needed to raise capital for Strava. Give us a little bit of the history of the capital raising negotiations you had with venture capitalists and what you learned there. It's one of the number one questions I get in negotiation from entrepreneurs is, hey, how do I negotiate with venture capitalists and what can I learn from that? So love your history and learnings there.
Yeah. So Michael and I self-financed for about a year and a half, 2 years. So we were fortunate that we had some capital of our own that we put towards it. We put in the neighborhood of $1.5 million into the business to really get it off the ground, hire a team. And then it was about 2.5 years in where we really saw two things that were going on. One was we were seeing very good viral growth without a lot of marketing, basically no marketing expense. And we were seeing strong conversion rates. We'd had a subscription business from day one. And so we were seeing really strong conversion. And so we were beginning to see an opportunity where we could raise capital for growth purposes and wanted to put some fuel on the fire. So our Series A was a $3.5 million round back in 2010. It was led by a firm called Sigma Partners at the time. Now they're called Jackson Square Ventures. We had an easier time getting an audience, talking to folks. And that Series A was really a choice between, do we bring in a group of angels that we really know and admire and we know would add value, or do we raise from an institution? We chose to raise from the institution in part because one of the angels was one of those partners there. He was a known commodity. He'd been a good friend. He'd been an operator at Kanna. And so it was an easy call. The economics made a lot of sense. And then you just fast forward. We did a Series B because we had another moment in time where we were shifting from being a web business to being a mobile business. So actually it happened pretty quick. It was only probably less than a year later that we needed to do a Series B because of opportunity, which again, I would caution entrepreneurs, like the hardest raise you do should be your first one. After that, you want to raise capital when you don't need it. You want to raise it on opportunity rather than need. And in the case of Strava, we had a situation where we'd launched our mobile app in 2010 timeframe, 2011. And sure enough, we were seeing a dramatic shift in user behavior once we had a mobile app. And so I don't want to say it was easy, but we were able to go out and raise, I think at that point, $12 million to really begin building a mobile-focused business.
Let's dive into that one because you're in a great position where probably you talked to a bunch of venture capitalists and you had more than one that wanted to do the deal. So talk about the negotiation process there.
I've been hesitant to use outside advisors. The only time that we've had any kind of outside was our very last round that we did in 2020, where it was a significant round where we had JP Morgan. Otherwise, we always raised just internally through our own resources. Great attorneys, always had that. A shout out to a gentleman named Warren Lazaro and David Macarishan, two partners. They're with a firm called OMM here, but frankly, it's the partners that matter, and they're partners that backed me in the earliest days of Kana. Took me on when I was 25 years old and, on a whim. And they've been great advisors, mentors to me now, again, for 25, 30 years. So I can't stress enough to entrepreneurs out there, find yourself a good attorney early and lock in, because they'll be invaluable throughout your career, both personally and professionally.
let me underscore something you just said, which is a lot of my young Stanford students will come to me and say, hey, I got Wilson Sonsini, or I got Cooley, or I got, Fenwick and West on my side. And I say, well, who's the partner? And they say, well, I don't know, but these are great law firms. And what you alluded to there that I want to underscore is it's the partner, it's not the firm.
You're spot on. That's it. A lot of people don't know OMM here in this valley. It's a massive firm, O'Melveny Myers, but we are with them because that's where Warren and David are. And I'd say the same thing is true, ironically, with venture. I'm quick to point out to people when you're going out and people start talking about all the name brand firms, the first thing I ask is, well, but who's the partner that you're talking to? Because that's the relationship you're going to have. That's who's going to be in the foxhole with you or on the playing field with you and in the good days and the bad days. So I'm a big believer in you pick partners, not firms. And that's true whether it's legal or investment or others.
Back to the Series B, you had your choice between multiple firms. Did you kind of have multiple term sheets and negotiate them against each other? How did you do it?
This is where I'm afraid our story sometimes may be too unique here. I had an independent director at the time that we had brought on, a wonderful guy named Jamie McJunkin that I had known back from my TA days, who worked at the time and still does for a very small, quiet firm called Madrone Capital Partners. And it's basically one of the Walton families, their family office. And Jamie worked for them. But I had asked Jamie to be an independent director. We had created a board of directors early on in Strava. It's something that I think is important to have. And so we had independent directors even before we'd raised any capital. And Jamie was one of them. And Jamie was very active at Strava. He's a passionate user. He's a good advisor to us. And we got to this Series B and we started talking to different firms. And Jamie had gone to his partners, even though we are not typical of what Madrone invests in. Madrone tends to put $100 million into Hyatt hotels. With their investment criteria is not typically
Later
Strava
stage.
Series B. Exactly. But Jamie was putting so much energy into Strava that he felt a little guilty. So he said, hey, look, we'll put together a term sheet if it's acceptable. Does this make sense? And I have another phrase that I love to share with entrepreneurs, which is speed over greed. Look, if you've got a partner that you like, you've got terms that you feel are fair and reasonable, do not waste time. Raising capital is like running a second business. So the less time you can do it and the more you can be back focused on just building your business, the better you are. And so we short-circuited the process. Kudos to Jamie. He saw the opportunity. Madrone came in and they've been a fantastic partner since. They're still our largest shareholder today.
That's great. Let's talk about later rounds of funding. There's so many. We could do a whole podcast on how to negotiate with capital and venture folks. One of the things that I tell younger folks is you got to try to align interests with your investor. And that can come in the form of the fund and where they are in their fund cycle. It can come in the form of the partner and have they had recent exits or not. It can come in the form of time frame. You've got the option of evergreen funds versus someone who's going to flip it in 3 years. There's just almost no entrepreneurial journey that's just up and to the right always. And so talk about lessons there from aligning interests with investors if you think that's important.
Look, if you can wave your magic wand as an entrepreneur and you can have evergreen funds, Madrone being one example of that, where it's a family office, so where they don't have these set fund times of 5 and 10 year increments and so forth. I do think that there's some tactical advantage to that in that, in general, the conversations with Madrone were always much more sort of almost owner mindset. It wasn't about when can we generate liquidity. It's are we increasing value? Are we increasing? And so that was always just refreshing to have. Now we had traditional venture from day one because of the Series A. So it wasn't like it was we only had evergreen in our fund, but just that conversation, I would argue, is different. It was nice to have with Jamie. And to this day, I think he thinks that way. I would say, though, the most important thing that we've learned over time is where is the partner that's going to be involved? Where are they in their career process? And this is probably the one place I'm a huge believer in first timers and, put people in the deep end and allow them to, struggle a bit. And because I often have found on my own teams, like that's where you find the real talent. the exception being in venture. What I've learned is that if at all possible, you want to have the seasoned venture capitalist who has a strong track record, has been successful for two reasons. One is they've been through the challenges. They are going to sort of respond the way you'd hope when something's going to go sideways, because it always does. Something's going to go wrong. Something's not going to go as expected. And somebody who's just seen that pattern before doesn't tend to panic. The second reason is if they've made money for their partners and for their fund in the past, that, I don't want to say the pressure's off, but their partnership understands that they're successful at what they do. And so there's some latitude in there. Whereas when you have a junior person who's just started a venture fund, is out to prove themselves, in a worst case scenario, they will start to make decisions that are in the best interest of them trying to generate liquidity versus what the company needs. And so I'm the one place where I'm like, I will always take the seasoned partner with a strong track record, is not on hiring for an operating team, but absolutely when it comes to sort of raising money.
I agree with most of that. I guess the one exception for me is sometimes the kind of brand partner, and most firms have a brand partner or maybe two people that are kind of the top of the heap. And I've just seen multiple cases over the years where when you get that guy or that person and they've already made a ton of money, their expectations for an exit are so high. Now, you've been at two companies that are going to achieve those expectations so the brand partner can work. But let's say you're a first-time entrepreneur and you've got a $100 million exit on the table, that opportunity. If you're a brand partner, they're not going to let you take that exit. And so do you agree with that, or?
I do. There's a bell curve. I'm laughing because I've had the brand partners on the board as well. And no, there's probably stuff that can't quite go into this podcast today, but I fully appreciate what you're saying. And so I'd say there's a bell curve, and there's some sweet spot that's in there where perfect world, again, you and I are we're optimizing for the ideal outcome. And I want to be clear, like, again, speed over greed, the money is green. If you can raise capital in terms that you're okay with, go and you'll deal with it. But if you can ideally find it, if you can find somebody who has a track record, but they're still building their career, that's the ideal person. No question about it. Oh yeah. I've had some characters on my boards over the years. Love them to death, but oh wow, are they high maintenance? Yeah.
Well, let's talk about conflicts on boards, because certainly all venture-backed boards where the finance guys play an important role have conflicts. There's just no way, no one can convince me that the interests always align. And so when you did have the inevitable conflicts that you had on your boards, of either company, how did you resolve those?
Well, there's one that comes to mind that taught me a lot. That was, now we're fast forwarding in this Strava's life cycle quite a bit, but 2019, we had hired an outside CEO, a really good guy, a guy named James, who had been with us. He'd come in I guess early 2017. So he'd been with us a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and done some very good things. But as we got into the early parts of 2019, we could see we had problems. Let's just put it that way. Strava was beginning to struggle. It was spread really thin across a lot of initiatives. It was not sitting on a lot of cash. In fact, it was using a line of credit to really fund its operating expenses. So we were going into debt. There just were things about it that you didn't have to look hard to say, like, this doesn't feel healthy. And the challenge, and why I bring it up relative to board dynamic, is that in a perfect world, you have a unified board who's there advising that CEO and giving the CEO the help that they need and some clear direction. And that wasn't happening. We had close to a unanimous board, but we had one board member who had strong opinions and rightfully so. That was this person's right, but made it challenging because given that one, there was just debate. I would just say we spent too much time, probably the better part of almost 6 months, debating who was right and who was wrong. And was the CEO's path right along with this other? And it led to a situation where, ironically, by the end of 2019, the situation was untenable. Like the company itself was now in such dire straits that the choice was obvious. The CEO had to be replaced. Michael and I actually ended up stepping back into the company because we didn't have an obvious replacement. So we stepped back in and we made some fairly radical changes to the business.
Is there a do differently in retrospect where you could have handled that, two factions on the board, they want different things. If you look back and you were advising someone in the same circumstance today, any conflict resolution mechanism within the board that you'd suggest?
I think we needed to have a better decision process where if a board is not aligned, how do we make decisions? How can we make some decisions and move it forward? And instead we got into this, what you talked about earlier, some analysis paralysis, and let's wait and see what the next quarter shows. And we started to do some of that didn't serve anybody well. Didn't serve the CEO, didn't serve the stakeholders, the employees, led to some hard stuff that then took place in late 19 and early 2020.
Okay, well there we are. You come back into the company. You and Michael the band is back. 2019. You come in. I remember in that era, you and I talking about some difficult conversations, honestly, you had with the user base. And let's look at those negotiations. I think you did, a paywall shift. Maybe give us the context since users probably don't know about what happened and then how you negotiated with the community, because you really have a tight culture and community.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. So the context was, I sort of alluded to this, by the end of 2019, we're $20 million in debt. We're hemorrhaging cash. We're spread very thin, meaning we're trying to do a lot of different things business-wise. I think we had 3 or 4 different revenue models that we were at least exploring, and we weren't good at anything. And there was a thesis that Michael had early on, which was we'd rather be great than big. And we kind of took that and we brought that back in. Michael became the CEO. I became executive chairman. We did a reduction in force. We took down the company by about 15% of the team. So that was difficult. That had never happened in Strava's history. But we rallied the existing group, and we rallied them around one very simple premise, which is we need to go become great at subscription. If we don't have that business firing on all cylinders and doing well, all these other opportunities that exist in front of Strava, they'll cease to exist. So let's circle the wagons. Let's focus the whole company around subscription and see if we can't really begin to bring value back to our membership. And so we jumped into that. In early 2020, we started doing a lot of analysis, and we did 2 things. One was we realized we need to just start delivering on subscription value. So I think we released something like 100 features in the next 3 months to folks, just big and small, lots of great things. But the other thing we did was we looked hard at the existing sort of what was available for free and what you paid for. And we had always been told that our free was too good. We accepted that, and we realized that there were some things, some specific features, some leaderboard type of things that really should be on the paywall side, should be on the subscription side rather than the free. And so we began the process of how we would make that transition happen. And we marched towards a release date in the late spring of 2020, where we would actually move that paywall, move those features from one side to the other, and began the process of communicating with our membership. And there was a letter. There's a still out there, I'm sure, somewhere on the internet. There's a letter from Michael and myself to the Strava community where we outline in very stark terms, look, here's the history. Here's what the company's been going through. This is what we want to do. This is how we're doing it. This is why we're making these paywall shifts. Here's the value you're trying to get for subscription. And we're going to make this change. And that combined with COVID turned out to be the elixir that Strava needed, because the combination of COVID, which basically took a whole new portion of the population and focused them on health and wellness. And all of a sudden people didn't have to commute to work. So they had time to ride their bike and run outside. And that was the only thing you could do, right? Because you couldn't gather indoors. So we saw tremendous growth at the top of our funnel as COVID started. And now we had this new revenue engine, this revenue focus. And so we saw, frankly, millions of people joining our subscription business. And those who were subscribers were willing to stick with us. It wasn't without bumps along the way. We clearly had people who were not pleased with us. But the net result was that we were transparent. We made the change. We made a commitment that we weren't going to be changing things on the paywall every quarter, that this was sort of a one and done type of phenomenon. And it proved very successful. If I fast forward to the end of 2020, Stan, it was a great year for us. We paid off all of our debt. We were highly profitable. We were growing at rates we hadn't seen in our history, and really able to start making investments in the future of the business.
So again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do remember either talking to you or hearing about a price increase, and maybe it was a later price increase that you got a lot of backlash in the community. Was that fast forwarded a few years later? But I think there's just some fun lessons here on how to do that kind of a thing. Sounds like in 2020, your letter was effective. COVID helped you. You got a bump, but price increases don't always get taken well. And it seems like I remember you had one that was a little sticky. Is that correct?
No, you're exactly. If there's a good way to communicate with your customers, there's also the really difficult ways. So context here, you're right. You have to fast forward to late 2022, early 2023. While we had moved the paywall, what we had never done in Strava's history was raise prices. Shame on us. We should have been doing it years earlier. I should have been doing it while I was CEO. It just hadn't been baked into the system. And so for a variety of reasons, it was clear we needed to do it. We're now, we're a company that operates in 185 countries. I think it's 15 or 20 different languages. There's lots of currencies that we're dealing with. So this isn't just like a single pay raise that we're trying to do across the world. It's actually much more finely tuned. There were price drops that were going on in some countries. There were some price increases in others that were holding flat. We were really trying to become much better at understanding the cultural nuances and the economic opportunities that existed. And so we raised prices, in the US being an example. And two things happened. One, something we couldn't control was that most of the price raising happens, for those of you familiar with the App Store, it happens via the App Store. So we don't have good control of the language. So people were getting notifications that their pricing was changing, so oftentimes dramatically, not just by 10%, we had some old members who'd been with us where the price was 50%, 60%, 70% more than they'd paid in the past. And they were only finding out about it because the App Store was notifying them rather than our ability to get in front of them and do that. But then I think we would also own the mistakes we made where we sort of, because it was this gradual rollout, we hadn't figured out a way to just effectively communicate to the community. Again, here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. And we're going to do this one time, in the sense that once we have it, what you'll see is much more of a traditional, every few years, Strava will work with the, as inflation and so forth, kind of what you see in subscription businesses now. I think we're all accustomed to seeing some kind of price increase. It was because it was so dramatic and without the communication that we faced a buzzsaw. We faced a lot of feedback, shall you say, from our community that wasn't happy, and we worked through it. Net, I will say, here we are in 2024. We're pleased with where the community's come out. So I think they've supported us despite some of our own sort of shortfalls.
One thing that's come through this discussion is that you've got passionate users that care a lot, and negotiating with them. I mean, how many users do you have now? It's a big group of people.
Yeah, I think we're somewhere north of 125 million.
Okay, so 100, and there probably aren't a lot of consumer. I mean, do you call yourself a fitness app? I mean, I just can't imagine 125 million people doing anything in the App Store other than some of the social media. So you've got this big, passionate group. Are there other stories or examples of when you've had to negotiate with the community or factions in the community that would be interesting for listeners?
Oh yeah. Numerous times. I'll give you one. Early days of Strava, because this may resonate with folks and other entrepreneurs. So we had a theory when we launched Stan that it's better to be really good with a small niche audience than it is to try to address a huge addressable market early on. So I often refer to it as, don't confuse go-to-market with vision. Our vision was to support a global community of athletes across lots of different activities. If you're active, you should be part of the Strava community, and whether that's walking, hiking, swimming, surfing, biking, skiing. But that's not how we launched. We launched by being very focused on of a specific audience, the road cyclist. And our thesis was, if we can get that right and we can deliver leadership in that space, one, it'll give us credibility in the market to expand. Two, it'll give us the confidence that we've got something, and how do we think about, new verticals and new sports. So it was working really well. And we got to about 2012 and it's time to expand. Let's think about how we expand into running. Well, our challenge was, how do you do that? What do you do? And again, very long story short, we launched 2 apps. We wanted to keep our cyclists pure. We didn't want them to feel like we weren't being authentic to them. So we launched this totally separate run app, and we tried to keep them separate. But then we realized that we actually had members who are running and riding, and it just became confusing. And so it was about 2 years later that we merged the app back together. And a lot of that was just having faith that our customers, they're in for the journey. They appreciate what Strava is providing, and sometimes being, not that we made a mistake. It's not that I regret doing those, but that how you effectively communicate even the services you're trying to provide to whom you're trying to provide them was a real art rather than a science.
How many sports are you supporting now, out of curiosity? Because imagine you had to have an app for each sport that you're supporting.
Yeah, and so therein lies the lesson. So we have about 50 sports today, and we only did the 2 apps. So once we figured out that it wasn't about merging and having separate apps, but in fact, giving someone the kind of experience they want. If someone wants to be a Strava cyclist only, and they don't want to have any friends on Strava, they can use it. It's a great I like to refer to it as it's the world's greatest virtual online diary for your cycling activities. And you can do that. But the vast majority of people on Strava, they're doing lots of things. It just depends on the season. It depends on where they are in their life. It depends on what injury they have. Any given week, you'll find me posting my hikes and then a bike ride, and then if it's the winter time and we're skiing on the weekend. So we tend to be multi-active, unless you're a professional athlete and you can only do one thing. So we learned pretty quickly that most of our athletes, they enjoy sort of that mix anyway, and we can still work with partners today. Strava, I think we have 120,000 API partners. There's great individual apps for sports, whether it's yoga or skiing or rowing or whatever it is. We didn't have to go build it. We just needed to really work hard on our partnership efforts so that we could partner with those folks and deliver value to them, and vice versa. We're delivering customers to them, and they can, in turn, sort of allow the right data to flow back into Strava.
We're running out of time, but I want to hit one more issue, which is, you said, how many countries are you guys in now?
Oh gosh, there are uploads in, I think, 185 countries today. Yeah.
So most countries, there are Strava users. And that just has to, we talk in the negotiation class about cross-cultural negotiations, internationalization of products. So what are some kind of key learnings, lessons, experiences about, internationalizing the company, and any cross-cultural things that have come up and what you've learned there?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, actually, I'll a silly one that I'll tell you, just because I think it's relevant for anybody trying to really build consumer app, even before we got to countries, just the sports themselves. So as I mentioned, we built cycling, and then we wanted to build for runners. Well, we had a lot of cyclists who work inside the company. I'll never forget one of the first times I saw the running app, and it showed the speed of the runner. It showed it in miles per hour rather than minutes per mile, which is sort of how, if you're a runner, you want to know how fast you're running per mile, not miles per hour. But I tell that because culturally, internally, until we sort of actually began to really build a running culture internally that could understand those nuances and kind of be authentic to that run community, we weren't going to be successful. I can tell you a whole lot of mistakes we made there as we transitioned from running to cycle. Forget the 2 apps, just getting the experience is authentic. And I think the same could be said of culturally, and as we moved into different countries and understanding it. Best example, we couldn't figure out what was going on in Brazil. Brazil was starting to grow in ways that we had never anticipated. It wasn't like we put resources towards it. It wasn't like we were in Brazilian Portuguese, but it was just taking off. And we went to visit, and we came to realize, oh, this is fascinating. If you go and really study that culture there, the marriage between social, which is they are hyper social. They love, and you can see it in other social media. You can see it on Instagram and Facebook and elsewhere. Like Brazil loves the social connection, and their love for sport is unparalleled due to climate, just due to sort of culture, football and soccer and the beach, and they love it. And so you combine those two, and it's like the perfect storm. And so what we learned was that despite being a global company, we needed to learn how to be local. And that wasn't just about being localized language-wise. It was actually having people on the ground. So today, Strava has individuals in places like Brazil and Tokyo and Spain and Italy and the UK, so that we really understand the way in which our members are using it in those countries and can address their needs. And it's 80-20, 80% of the time it's the same, but that last 20% ends up being really important.
What percent of your revenue comes from international versus domestic US?
I think it's about the same as our mix. So we're about 80-20 today. I think it's like 82% are outside the US and 18% are in the US. And if I'm not mistaken, revenue is about the same. It's It might be just slightly higher in the US just because the US monetizes fairly well, but so maybe it's 80-20 versus 82-18, but
yeah, so I just think that's such a success story to have sort of started off as this. What was your acronym for the male cyclist that you were targeting when you first started Strava?
Yeah, we love to call them, and because I was one myself, a mammal, MAMIL, middle-aged men in Lycra. That was our target audience, Stan. In the early days, it's like if you were a middle-aged man in Lycra, you probably had a $5,000 bike sitting in your garage and you had a Garmin computer on your handlebars. That was our target audience. So
you've gone niche and to broad. Congratulations on all of your success. The sort of last question I sometimes ask people is things that have persuaded you. I know you're a big reader. We've talked about, the value of nonfiction as well as fiction. So what are a couple of books in either category that you feel like have really had a big impact on you?
Well, I guess my all-time classics on a purely fiction side, Count of Monte Cristo is the book that I've probably read 4 times at this point. I can't really even explain why. I don't want to say that I'm all about revenge, which is clearly part of that book, but I just perhaps the endurance side there. So that one to me, I love picking up. Business-wise, my all-time classic would be a book called Built to Last by Jim Collins. I think it's withstood the test of time. It might be a little hard today for entrepreneurs because they may not even recognize some of the businesses that he wrote about, but the lessons learned in that book are timeless. So those are the classics. Yeah, more recently, there's so much good stuff out there right now. I finished Barbarian Days, which is great, chronicles a gentleman in his life surfing. The Wager. I don't know if you've read that one yet. The Wager.
I have not read it, but I know of it.
It's very, talk about anytime an entrepreneur thinks like they're having a hard day, they need to pick up the book Wager, because what folks used to do back 150, 200 years ago for their life work, we've got it very easy. That's, we need to maintain perspective. So,
it's funny. I was thinking about that. I saw my bookshelf the other day, Endurance, about the Shackleton adventure. And similarly, It's like, if you're having a tough day, think about what it was like for Ernest Shackleton leading that group of marauders.
This is very similar books. If you enjoyed Endurance, you will enjoy The Wager. And that's exactly right. Yeah.
Great. Well, Mark, thanks so much for your time. It was a great conversation, and we'll be talking soon, I'm sure.
That's great, Stan. Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to All Things Negotiation. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoyed the show, please consider giving us a rating and leaving a review, which helps others find the show. The show was produced by Benny Beausoleil. Original music by Peter Breinhold. Designed by Aubrey Benson. Thanks for listening.